with guest speaker, Dr. Marcella David. Thanks to Dr. David and to everyone who has joined us online today. I'm Bill Reisinger, ICFRC board member and program committee chair, and I will be hosting today's program. We have a special program sponsor today, Mark Margolin of Cetra Wealth in Coralville, Iowa. Mike is a longtime friend and sponsor of ICFRC, and we thank him for his commitment. In addition, we acknowledge and thank these other annual donors and sponsors for their support. Midwest One Bank, the University of Iowa's International Programs, Honors Program, and Public Policy Center, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, the Iowa Arts Council through the Iowa Department of Cultural Affairs, and City Channel 4 for its support in live streaming our in-person programs and for providing access to all of ICFRC's programs, along with the UI Library Archives. ICFRC has adopted the Native American Land Acknowledgement prepared for the City of Iowa City Ad Hoc Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Human Rights Commission. We recognize that our home community of Iowa City now occupies the homelands of Native American nations to whom we owe our commitment and dedication. The full text of our acknowledgement is available on our website at icfrc.org. As we get started, we ask that you keep your audio and video turned off for the duration of the presentation, so you do not interrupt our speaker during her remarks. Following these remarks, at about 4:45 p.m., we will have a 15-minute Q&A. You will be able to submit your questions via the chat function. At that time, we will invite you to turn on your video, but please keep your audio muted to avoid any background noise. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marcella David. Dr. Marcella David is Senior Vice President, Provost, and Professor in the Business and Entrepreneurship Department at Columbia College, Chicago. In her role as Senior Vice President and Provost, Dr. David serves as the college's Chief Academic Officer and provides leadership for all academic planning and review, including academic diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, advancement of faculty scholarship, research and creative work, global education, online learning, student retention and persistence initiatives, and the allocation of financial resources in accordance with academic priorities. Before joining Columbia in 2019, Dr. David was a visiting professor of law at Florida State University. She previously served as the Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs at Florida A&M University, one of the nation's top historically Black colleges and universities. Prior to that, as many of today's viewers know, she was on the faculty of Iowa's College of Law, and among other roles, served as Associate Dean of the college and Special Assistant to the President for Equal Opportunity and Diversity. Dr. David received her BS in Computer Science and System Engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and her JD, magna cum laude, from the University of Michigan Law School. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marcella David, who will speak about international perspectives on Black Lives Matter.
Thank you. Bill, can we do a check? Is my slide still showing, or did it get dislodged?
Your slide is showing. Okay,
wonderful. Thank you. And it's truly a pleasure to be here and to see familiar names popping up. I don't think I've ever been so surrounded by happy Black boxes on Zoom before. So I really appreciate seeing so many friends. It is my great pleasure to be here. I don't really have remarks per se. I have some notes. I hope that will mean that I will not spend too much time looking down and reading, and that this will be the start of a conversation. But I am looking forward to talking a little bit about this topic. Many of you know that I have as a pretty serious hobby photography. And so at least some of the photos, including the photo that you see right now, is photos that I took here in Chicago at one of the demonstrations that happened after George Floyd was murdered, going up South State Street. I had an apartment at the time that was on South State Street. I could begin to see the people swelling and moving down the street, and I went downstairs and captured some images. There will also be some international images, which will be obviously not mine, and I'll be sure to let you know about those images as well. So I'm actually offering something that I call ruminations when I am talking with my students here at Columbia College. It's primarily an undergraduate and master's granting institution. And so I have the great pleasure of teaching some students in first year class that we have here. And as I was preparing materials for the class, I decided on ruminations as a way of distinguishing the materials that I'm presenting when it's appropriate. And what I want to talk a little bit about today, under the rubric or the topic umbrella of the connections between Black Lives Matter and international relations, is in part, what does Black Lives Matter mean to me? So I'm setting the table, and then having set the table, talk a little bit about what I think Black Lives Matter means to the world. Some of this may surprise you, I think, I hope, but what I'm really hoping to do is to open up a slightly different perspective than the traditional perspective on some of these topics. So what are ruminations? Just want to let you know that having come from the world where in the law school, everything is researched to death and cited to death, this is not researched to death and cited to death. I am going to offer some general thoughts about the topic. These are ideas that I pretty much know are true, but I'm not offering any kinds of citations or depth of research that you might get in the law school, hence calling it ruminations. And in fact, the only citation that I will offer is a citation that I think is an interesting citation and not necessarily driven by any kind of research imperative. So what is Black Lives Matter? And if you go to the official Black Lives Matter website, it says that Black Lives Matter was founded in 2013 in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer. Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, Incorporated, is a global organization in the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada, whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. So I think Black Lives Matter had a very specific mission, but as is the case, I think, for many movements, the mission has grown beyond its original boundaries. And if you ask 10 people on the street what Black Lives Matter means, they probably all have slightly different descriptions. Some might even be descriptions that are uncomplimentary about what Black Lives Matter is and stands for. So I'm going to share my personal view about Black Lives Matter. From my perspective, although it has in its genesis a very strong link to violence and has been very closely associated in the intervening years to specifically police violence, I think it's gone beyond that. It still has that link to me. I still have the close association between Black Lives Matter and police violence, or other state violence, which I'm including in other state violence, violence that may be perpetrated against Black people by people who are operating under the imprimatur of state authority, or who operate under the indifference of state authority. And I think the best example of that is the Ahmaud Arbery shooting, where the people who shot him are claiming that they were executing a citizen's arrest, so operating under the imprimatur of state authority, first example. And then second nature of the example is that when it first happened, they weren't even detained by the police. which I think brings up a whole host of questions of why they weren't even detained by the police, having shot a man while he was jogging. So that to me continues to have a very close association, this notion of the state's relationship to a segment of the population and violence that's associated with that relationship. But I also associate Black Lives Matter with a lot of the work that has been left undone in our country, including civil rights, economic rights, the structures of racism in the United States, voting rights. So it is, and to me, encompasses the entire kind of Black situation in the United States at this time, when I mean Black Lives Matter, by Black Lives Matter. Let me spend a second talking about what Black Lives Matter is not. It isn't anti-anything. And so I think there are a lot of people, including one friend of mine, who say that they don't like the idea of Black Lives Matter because all lives matter. And I will say that I found that conversation extremely frustrating until I had that conversation with my friend, who's a very dear friend, who's a humanist, and who was really tortured by the idea that, as she understood it, Black Lives Matter was forcing her to choose between privileging the interests of Blacks over privileging the interests of everyone else. I tried to explain it to her, and I actually found on a website a very helpful description, and I'll try and paraphrase it here. If you had 3 children, and one of the children in the morning didn't get any breakfast, maybe they woke up late and they didn't get any breakfast. And let's say at lunch, you all went out for lunch and the child didn't get any lunch because you went to some place where they were serving something to which the child is allergic and they couldn't partake of lunch. At the end of the day, at dinner time, if you have those 3 children sitting in front of you, you might say, Susie is hungry. When you say Susie is hungry, that doesn't mean you don't think the other children shouldn't be fed. You don't think, it's not that you're saying you think that the interests of this child are more important than the interests of the other children, that this child should be loved more than the other children. What you're saying is that there is a particular need, a particular vital need that has been unsatisfied, and that this is a moment to focus in on that need because of the fact that it has been unsatisfied throughout breakfast and lunch and all of the other opportunities to eat during the day. And I really appreciated, and my friend in our subsequent conversations really appreciated having that way of framing what Black Lives Matter means. It's that we have to focus on the condition of Black Americans in particular, not to the exclusion of others who are in need, but in order to understand that at almost every turn, the need has been discounted, dismissed, ignored, or otherwise unfulfilled. And now the need is critical. So I don't view Black Lives Matter as being anti-police. However, I think that there's been this interesting way of thinking that if you talk about Black Lives Matter and then criticize the police, that you are doing something that is untoward, unfair, and unappreciated, unwarranted, just completely beyond the pale. I am not sure why we got to that point. I think that we definitely need to interrogate the way police are deployed, the way police are funded, the way police are trained, and the way police are shielded from responsibility for their actions. And that to me is also an important part of Black Lives Matter. So it's not anti-police, but I don't believe that interrogation is being anti-police. I believe that that type of interrogation, that point of interrogation, is very important and inextricably linked to what we need to do in order to move past this moment. one or two other things that I'll say about Black Lives Matter. It is a call to action, I think. It's fair to describe it as such. It's a rallying cry to those people who have been focused on this, and it's energizing to those people who have been focused on it. And it's also, I think, a way of bringing the matter to the attention, sometimes in a chiding way, of people who haven't paid attention to the issues and conditions relating to Blacks in America for a very long time. So it's that as well. And because of that, I think it's sometimes messy. And I know that there are a lot of people who have tried to distance themselves from the idea of Black Lives Matter because there were, with some protests, looting, violence, and other criminal activity. Now, I have to say, as an aside, I'm not sure why people are surprised by that. In the United States, for example, the very first step of the American Revolution was an act of looting, which we fondly called the Boston Tea Party, which in effect was worse than anything that happened, I think, in the wake of the George Floyd protests, because that was intended to be blamed on, air quotes, the Indians, as part of the planning of that looting. So it was actually a very directed and very kind of evil intended looting, which is a little bit different from what we might have seen and understood after George Floyd. But if you have the time and have not seen it, you should go to YouTube and look for a video that is an interview by Kimberly Jones, where she talks about how people get to the point of wanting to loot, of engaging in that kind of criminal activity as a carry-on from being engaged in protests. And I don't think there's any explanation that you'll find that will be more genuine and more thought-provoking than that. So I won't try and do that. So let me keep going here. And having talked a little bit about Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter in the United States, let me talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter from the international perspective. And I have to say, I remember seeing some of the news stories, because after the protests started happening in the United States, there were two instances where you see protests where people would be very surprised. And so one is, it's a rural town in Nowheresville, the United States, and they're protesting about George Floyd. And this is shocking to us, says the newscaster, because we're surprised that they're paying attention to these things happening in big cities and that they even care or they feel connected. And the other place where you would see newscasters say, wow, there's another protest about George Floyd happening, and we're so surprised by that, is in the international context. I myself found it a little surprising, not that it was happening, but how widespread it was. And I would say that I found it surprising in the breadth and the passion, and that people kept coming out day after day. And here are some images that I found from the web that I think are really capture the global nature of this protest. This is one from South Africa. This is one from France. Some of the quality is not so wonderful, but I was snapping more content than necessarily quality. This is one from Seoul. This is one from Helsinki. And I want to come back to this one and start talking again against the backdrop of this image, which is an image, another image from South Africa. First off, you have to look in the back corner and just see that they have the image of the Olympic protest in the background. from the 1970s, of 60s, of Tommy Smith and John Carlo raising their fists. And so it already begins to lay the foundation for some of what I want to say in the next minute about how longstanding international awareness has been of Black condition in the United States. But for the moment, I want to focus on this man's t-shirt, which says Black is beautiful. And I want to just note Blackness as a unifying classification. And this has been a little bit of a struggle for me, because we've had conversations, as you know, in the past few years, debunking the notion of race as a genetic reality and being anything other than a social construct that was created, in some ways imposed, in order to create a world order that stacked people in different levels for sometimes self-interest and capitalistic purposes, right? I know I said a lot there, but I'm going to move on from that kind of very complicated statement. And in the United States, there has been a particular effort to move people from saying Black to saying African American in order to counter the idea that Black Americans are not American citizens, that the idea of saying they're Black, you're being identified as being Black without having American associated with it is an othering kind of perspective. And so a lot of people really have made a conscious effort to say African American or sometimes Black American. And I have always struggled with that personally, in part because I have found the notion of Blackness related to skin color has created an experiential point that many people around the world can connect with. And I have felt in kinship with other people who are dark complected, in part because the poor treatment of people who are dark complected is almost universal. And so I just want to point that out, because I think that is part of what fuels this notion of connection, that these people that you see here can imagine themselves being in the position of George Floyd, because in so many different ways, they have been in the position of George Floyd, and solely because of their skin color. So here's my one citation. An appeal to the world, prepared for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in 1947. And I'll come back to the text in a minute. So when I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter as an international matter, I want to highlight the 4 bullets here. And that is to say that Black lives have mattered in international relations for a very long time, for centuries. Black lives have mattered because they were the subject of international commerce through slavery. And then as slavery was taken over by the abolitionist movement was an international movement. And in fact, as you see how the United States has actually interjected itself or forged various connections, particularly in Central America and parts of South America, often those very connections were based on trying to protect slave interests in the United States against threats to slavery in the United States that were perceived as being related to things that were happening in our near neighborhood. And in particular, Haiti and Cuba are places where our kind of international footprint was in part shaped by our interests in protecting slavery. American Black civil rights was a theme that was discussed in Europe, and it has happened for a very long time. In my lifetime, I know that Paul Robeson and other creatives like Josephine Baker or Billie Holiday, they went to Europe. They've retreated to Europe in some ways because they found it to be a more welcoming and accepting place, and that they were able to do things in Europe that they were not able to do in the United States, and that people knew that that's why they were coming there. Similarly, when I was a child, we would go to Canada for vacations from New York because you could go to Canada and do things that you couldn't do in the United States. You could eat in a restaurant, any restaurant you wanted to when I was a little girl in Canada, and I could not do that when I was a little girl in all of the places I wanted to go to, my parents might have wanted to go to in New York. And so this was a point of conversation. And so people have been paying attention to the condition of Black people in the United States in all parts of the world. And in fact, when people like Paul Robeson and Billie Holiday and Josephine Baker were treated well in other parts of the world, and people would talk about it in the news, American politicians actually reacted poorly to that, and in some ways would target them for poor treatment because they were exposing our dirty secrets to the rest of the world. The US Black civil rights movement tapped into the Black diaspora connections that linked very closely to things that were happening in Africa with the end of the colonial period and the beginning of the independence movement. And it was fueled in part by a brief interest in, hey, should we leave the United States and emigrate to Africa? Should we go back to try and find home connections to various parts of Africa? That was a brief kind of movement, but it was a real movement. And it was forged by that connection. This reference here that you see, the NAACP actually appealed to the United Nations, and this is a document that they sent to the United Nations in 1947 to ask the United Nations to intervene to end segregation and to provide recourse to the Black civil rights movement in the international community. And certainly there were Black civil rights leaders who had a strong influence, a global influence. Of course, Martin Luther King is somebody who had a very global presence, but also Malcolm X and other, Stokely Carmichael and other leaders in the Black civil rights movement were identified by people in other parts of the world as having helped shape Black liberation movements globally. So Black lives have always mattered. Black US lives and the Black Lives Matter movement in some form, if you kind of connect it back to its historic roots that predate Trayvon Martin, has mattered internationally for a very long time. A second perspective on this international connection is that Black Lives Matter and the civil rights struggle within the United States has played a limiting factor on US international relations. So importantly, when the United Nations put forth various human rights treaties, senators, US senators, objected to the United States becoming party to those treaties, in part because they believed that it would give foreign powers the ability to comment on social situations in the United States. And the two social situations that they identified primarily were the conditions of Black Americans and the conditions of women in the United States. And so this was something that was influencing the way that we were interacting with the world. Today, I would say we still constrain our participation in human rights organizations in order to protect our ordering of society, our ordering of democracy, and to continue to project ourselves as being a democratic leader, even though there are some flaws that otherwise we might admit to in the way that democracy has unfolded in this country. And we are really protective of this notion of ourselves as the United States as being kind of a democratic leader and the democratic ideal. And that is, I think, something that we continue to see, and as we protect that, we often are trying to not put ourselves in a position where we're engaging in the world so that the world will be able to have leverage to try and tell us that we should change some of the things that we're doing. And then one could say that our own kind of racism has informed the way that we have interacted when there have been crises overseas. And in fact, we have discounted often harm that has happened to dark complected people. So in World War II, a lot of what happened in Africa was not considered concerning, even though it was really brutal and horrible. And I always remember that in 1985, President Ronald Reagan at the time said, well, those Black people in South Africa, they'll get their rights eventually. And it's already better now than it ever was. So we should just continue with constructive engagement because that's the right way to approach things. And at the same time, that the President Donald Trump, was marshaling the forces of the military to clear the streets around the White House of protesters of George Floyd's death. He was chiding the Chinese government for not allowing democratic participation and for trying to stifle the umbrella revolt that was unfolding in Hong Kong. So there has been, I think, a layering that has discounted across the world and in our relations across the world based on some of these experiences. Okay, my last international perspective. The international community is smart. The international community is not actually buying that we are the only promoters of democracy and that the United States has succeeded, and this is part of our narrative, because we are a democratic society. They understand that the truth is much more complicated than that. And they, in some ways, understand our history better than we understand our history. They know that slavery was brutal and that we continue to invest in slavery long past when the international community moved past it. They know of the brutality of lynching, where postcards were sent around the world of families picnicking under the brutalized and burned body of people who had been lynched under the watchful eyes of the police. They know that we have suppressed the vote in the United States, and they know all of these things. And so when the United States goes forth and says, we are talking about human rights from a position of strength and authority, they reject that. They absolutely reject that. And part of the reason why they reject that is because they know of our history. And certainly they know not only about the history of how Blacks have been treated in the United States, but also they will talk about the way that we have treated Native Americans, harkening back to the way that we began this conversation with the land acknowledgement statement. They understand how we have marginalized many different groups across our history. And so here's my one quote from the NAACP Appeal to the World. The United States has always professed to be a democracy. She has never wholly attained her ideal, but slowly she has approached it. The situation is far more serious than this. The disenfranchisement of the American Negro makes the functioning of all democracy in a nation difficult. And as democracy fails to function in the leading democracy in the world, it fails in the world. I would submit that when we are acting internationally, that there are people who are appreciating that we have less of the moral suasion to, much less of the moral suasion to talk about these matters than we project. And then we push back, when they push back against that idea, we lose the opportunity to engage in a meaningful matter that says, we know democracy is hard and we know democracy is imperfect. Let's talk about it in that context. So I'm going back to some more of these international pictures, some more places where you see protests. You know, it's so interesting how we might say that this is a cynical way of thinking about the conditions in the United States. I think a lot of people might say, yes, that there are problems in places like in some Arab countries where there's less than perfect democracy or indeed no democracy, but that until we address our own failings, that it becomes really hard for them to hear from us how they need to improve. Here's another link. How often do we actually, and I guess this shows, let me interrupt myself. I think this one shows in particular how the Black experience actually transcends the question of complexion, that there are people who understand the struggle in a way that has been removed from the idea of color and has been placed where it should be as a question of humanity. And that allows people to make linkages to other questions of liberation across various cultural traditions. And the last, obviously, we begin to see the real pushback then and the loss of credibility that the United States has, in part because of the way Black Americans continue to be treated. So here's my last slide where I try and summarize my random thoughts. And Black Lives Matter has always been a global phenomenon. I think we in the United States just haven't noticed it. And when I say we here, I mean that it hasn't been, we have protected ourselves from hearing, understanding, appreciating, and reacting to the international understanding and condemnation of how Black Americans have been treated for centuries. We haven't noticed that Black lives have mattered in the international community and have been appreciated sometimes in the international community more than they've been appreciated in our own community. And I guess my last concluding point is that I don't think we will ever achieve credibility internationally until we do right, and right here at home. So I think that's my set of remarks. Hopefully they made some sense, and I will stop sharing so I can see more of your faces if I can figure out how to stop sharing.
Thank you, Marcella. Really nice. So we now move to the question and answer portion of our program. You can submit your questions on the chat function. You can see the button at the bottom of your viewing screen. You are free to turn on your video function now, but please keep yourself muted. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, on behalf of ICFRC, I will thank all the members and donors for their support. We rely on the contributions from people in the community to carry out our free international programs. If you want to make a donation or join ICFRC, please go to icfrc.org. Thank you.
Have I stopped showing my screen? I can't see my controls. So I think you have to stop my controls because I have completely lost my controls. I have no controls anymore on Zoom.
All right, we'll try. We do still see your screen, but we'll try to. There we go.
There you go. Thank you.
All right, please use the chat function to ask questions.
I feel like I'm in a class.
Won't take long. Okay, so first question asks about what's next for Black Lives Matter internationally.
In some ways, I think the answer is no one knows. The Black Lives Matter movement is, okay, I'm going to say something that's really terrible, but I'm going to say it, and I don't mean it terribly, but it's kind of organized very similarly to the way that, I found it better. I was going to say something different. It's been franchised, right? So there's, I think, the core Black Lives Matter group, and what they have tried to do is create a space that allows for Black Lives Matter chapters to chart their own course. And what I think has been really powerful about that model is that it has helped carry the message beyond the 4 countries in which Black Lives Matter is officially incorporated. As we could see from those pictures, there are chapters and there are people who are working and thinking about this across the country. Across the globe, as well as across the country. I think that's really exciting. What I wonder about the influence Black Lives Matter will have, the global influence that Black Lives Matter will have in the United States. And for many of the reasons that I described, I think that'll be somewhat minimal. As I mentioned in international human rights organizations, when people bring up racial disparities in the context of the United States basically tries to ignore that criticism. But I think that it has given rise to kind of local iterations where people have used the organizing structures and the principles and the teachings on anti-racism to help fuel new ways of thinking about conditions in places like Ghana, new ways of thinking about conditions in places like South Africa, new ways of thinking about conditions. And South Africa is in some ways a really interesting parallel, where there was a lot of legal oppression, and then the legal oppression was lifted, but the structural racism continues to play a really important role in South Africa. And so I think the ways of thinking about that in the United States translate well to international spaces and to other spaces, and then get shaped by thoughts that have already been happening in South Africa and places like Ghana and other places, and then it gets fueled then gets funneled up and then shared across the network. And so I think it's really becoming much more rich because of the international aspects to it.
Can you say anything about how Black Lives Matter has affected Latin America in particular?
I can't say anything in particular about Black Lives Matter in Latin America. I know much less and have heard much less about the movement in Latin America. I think the idea of race in Latin America is very different from how it has played out in the United States. And I think that might be one of the reasons why, as I'm thinking about it, I've heard very little about it. Certainly there were some protests around George Floyd's death in Central America and South America, but I'm not thinking right now of any of the social movements, recent social movements that have really focused on Black Lives Matter in Central America or Latin America.
Okay, great. Here, a question asks, COVID-19 has impacted Blacks more than many others. How has this impacted the Black Lives Matter movement?
It's really been really interesting. I remember when the George Floyd protests began, there was a lot of trepidation about protesting in the COVID environment. People were afraid of COVID as much as they were afraid of being on the streets and having negative interactions with police officers. And I think that has been something that has had a real life impact, but I also think that it's something that has been an additional kind of rallying cry around Black Lives Matter. And so there have been some Black Lives Matter initiatives that have actually said, look, we're not going to be able to be healthy in our social interactions if we're not healthy as a community as well. And you have seen some people kind of spin off of the kind of very broad Black Lives Matter list of concerns and focus in on health and trying to use social justice as a mechanism for penetrating the Black community with health needs, with health resources, I should say, with health education, and with other social, trying to satisfy other social needs and welfare needs as well.
Great. So the next question asks, to what extent does Black Lives Matter and the international side of it suffer from the same paucity of international news in the US media or the media filtering news through US foreign policy interests?
It absolutely does. I was smiling because I remember when I first moved to Iowa, there was one of the local news stations had international news in a minute. And I remember they had a stopwatch, and sometimes they'd start talking. And if there was going to be more news in the minute, they'd like start talking faster, because obviously you couldn't have news for like a minute and 10 seconds, international news for a minute and 10 seconds. It was like very funny. I think that there is much more of an internal focus. Obviously, there are counterexamples. I think you'll get some good in-depth international reporting in some of the NPR and PBS NewsHour and other platforms, but there isn't as much of it. And I think it does get filtered through that lens. And I think it does get filtered through the US Department of State lens. Here's a great example. A few years ago, Putin said something about American exceptionalism. And when he was talking about American exceptionalism, he was talking about the doctrine of exceptionalism, where American exceptionalism is, as the flavor of this, is the United States promoting international law, but at times saying we don't have to comply with international law. We can be accepted from the constraints of international law in some circumstances. And so he wrote something about American exceptionalism and how he questioned it. And the response that you heard all newscasters talking about was kind of, how dare Putin say that the United States was not exceptional, that we are an exceptional country. We are the best country. We are the best in all sorts of ways. And that became the story. The story wasn't anything about how the United States was kind of interacting with the world. The story became all about how no one should challenge the supremacy of the United States in all measures. And I think that lens does permeate the way we hear news from folks about international topics. And I don't think the Black Lives Matter movement is any different from that. We certainly don't hear about some of the racial injustice things that are happening in South America. We don't hear very much anymore about how racial injustice continues to plague South Africa. Any reporting that we hear about what's going on in some of the very poor countries in Africa is very thin in terms of news, and it tends to often focus in on bad leadership, which is another way of focusing on the bad leadership that doesn't follow the American democratic model, as opposed to focusing on other structural issues that might have created those conditions. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Speaking of the world in a minute, what I thought was even funnier was often they couldn't get the full 60 seconds worth of international news, and the last 10 or 20 were actually domestic stories. That happened fairly often too. All right, the next question asks if you can say more about new ways of thinking about conditions in South Africa and the African continent. Something you mentioned, building off President Reagan in the 1980s.
I'm sorry, new ways of thinking. What did I say? What did I mean? Did I mean something about, oh my goodness, I'm not sure what I was referring to. If I was referring to Ronald Reagan, he said a lot of things that were just wrong about South Africa at the time that we were considering the sanctions bill, which was vetoed by him and then overridden by Congress to put in place economic sanctions on South Africa. New ways of thinking. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm not sure what I might have been referring to in that comment, Druitt.
Okay, so well, we can come back perhaps if we get a follow-up. Do you believe performative activism has negatively impacted BLM's goals?
So performative activism, that's an interesting turn of phrase. And if we mean by that marching and getting out on the street, no, I don't think it has. I think that that has shown the breadth of support and that breadth of support has surprised people. It has made some people, it has energized some people, created alliances that didn't previously exist. And I think those are all positive outcomes. If by performative activism, there's so many different ways to think about that phrase. We mean things like some of the arts, creative arts that have flowed from Black Lives Matter and artistic protests with people who have created murals, who have created signs, who have famously in Washington made the streetscape a sign of protest. I again, think that that has shown creativity and has found new ways to reach people. And so I think that's positive. If performative activism means acting out and looting or violence or throwing rocks and things of that nature, then I think that that has been a mixed bag. I think that that has, again, raised awareness of the depth of despair and frustration that people have been feeling. And certainly in sometimes that we have seen that in other countries, in other contexts, we have applauded and supported that expression of frustration and said that that was understandable. And I would hope that we have the ability to think a little bit differently about it here than in strictly a law and order paradigm.
All right, thank you. I think we've reached the time when we need to conclude our program. And I want to thank Dr. David for her really thought-provoking, interesting ruminations this afternoon. Marcella, as a small token of our gratitude for your talk, it's my pleasure to virtually present you with the highly coveted ICFRC mug, which we will arrange with you soon to deliver, and you hope can use it for coffee, tea, or the beverage of your choice.
Well, thank you. So much of a treat to not think about academic administration and to re-immerse myself in thinking about matters of international consequence, and also to see so many people here who I know. So a shout out to, like, I see Anne, and I saw Laura, and I see Janet, and it's so nice to see you all. It's just a treat. So thank you for the invitation. I have probably enjoyed it more than you.
All right, well, we will not have a program next week as we celebrate Thanksgiving. Our next program will be on Wednesday, December 1st with Dr. Madhav Joshi from Notre Dame University. He will discuss the intra-Afghan peace process, the Taliban victory, and women's rights. And we look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are adjourned.